Welcome back to Old School Sports and our Out of the Park Baseball 25 series, Can We Save the Oakland A's? And unfortunately, our 2039 season is over. We definitely have not saved the A's this year. After a very good regular season, when we won the AL West for a second straight year, American League best 99 wins, we were unfortunately ousted unceremoniously by our division rival Texas Rangers in the division series, 3-0. So our quest for a repeat and a quest for a third championship in 4 seasons have both come to a unceremonious end here in our first and only series of these 2039 playoffs. And apologies that the new episodes haven't been coming at the rate that they often have over the course of this series. Still remain very busy at work, but hoping to not work this entire weekend away. Hopefully we'll get out this episode and at least one more over the course of this weekend, and then we'll see what I can do after that going forward. But I am not going to abandon this series, even if I have to slow the pace of it a bit, given some pretty significant work-related obligations right now as we close in on the end of 2024 in the real world. Speaking of the real world, I just wanted to quickly touch on my Yankees. Last time we were together, the Yankees had just signed Max Fried, which I was pretty excited about, and it's Saturday morning as I am recording this episode. And last night the Yankees made a pretty big trade for Devin Williams. Gave up Nestor Cortez, a good solid starting pitcher. As we talked about in our last episode, felt like the Yankees had a surplus of pitching after the signing of Fried, surplus of starting pitching specifically. And although we also gave up Caleb Durbin, who I think could become a bit of a folk hero. I believe he was a Division III college player. He's undersized, and he's a 25-year-old who's poised to make his major league debut, now with the Brewers most likely this year, or more accurately in 2025. But I don't feel like the Yankees gave up anyone that they're going to regret giving up in the trade for Williams, and I don't think there's any argument that Williams is among the top 5 or so closers in baseball. Certainly has not had the playoff success you would hope out of a closer, highlighted just a month or so ago when Pete Alonso hit a big home run off of him to end the Brewers' season. But he's a huge upgrade to the back of the bullpen. Clay Holmes is left to become a starter with the Mets. Wish the Mets luck with that. Holmes had some really good moments out of the bullpen for the Yankees, but certainly some very significant struggles at times. And as good as Luke Weaver was in the closer role for the Yankees over the last part of the season and into the playoffs, I think Williams is certainly a big upgrade at closer. Definitely helps everyone else in the bullpen by pushing them into somewhat less prominent roles. And like what the Yankees have done with their pitching staff, how could you not add a top-end starter and a top-end closer in a matter of several days? That's certainly big progress. Still need to try to replace Juan Soto, and obviously that's not something that they're going to do with just one move. It's going to take multiple players and hopefully upgrading some of the positions in the roster that were weaker last year through multiple moves. Certainly disappointed that Kyle Tucker is not going to be a Yankee, at least for a year. But I really did not seriously think that the Astros were going to trade with the Yankees. So while that was a dream to add an outstanding all-around player into the Yankees lineup, who also happens to be a left-handed hitter, which they're desperately in need of with the loss of Soto. Although I hoped for that, never thought it was all that probable. The thing that I'm a little concerned about now is that Cody Bellinger, I think, was viewed by me at least as a more realistic potential trade target for the Yankees. And I'm just kind of wondering, with the Cubs now having added Tucker, who's in the final year before he's going to be eligible free agency, are they going to try to perhaps make a run at things this year and then let the chips fall where they may next offseason, in which case they may be a lot less amenable to trading Bellinger? Bellinger, not the hitter that Tucker is, but Bellinger could play center field. I know there's been talk that the Yankees would view him as a first baseman. Part of the reason why I'm not broken up about not getting Tucker is that, as I noted, didn't think it was all that realistic. But also, I would love to bring in someone who can play center field. I think is we're seeing with Jake Ortega in this version of the world here, center field can be a pretty demanding position that can contribute to some injuries. And given Aaron Judge's age and injury history in the real world, I'd love to be able to move him back to right field for this upcoming 2025 season. And although Bellinger at this point in his career is probably not a perfect center field option, I'd rather have him out there than Judge. Again, I don't know that the Cubs are going to be amenable to trading Bellinger. My hunch is that if you made a trade for a guy like Kyle Tucker, you're probably trying to make a run at it this year. So I'd be a little surprised if he was still on the market. Would love to bring him on board, but with Tucker off the board and Bellinger possibly off the board, it's not inconceivable to me that Judge could be the Yankees center fielder again next year, or that maybe they give the Martian, Jason Dominguez, a chance out there. He obviously looked brutal at times in left field in the limited amount of major league action he had last year, given his injuries and the Yankees' commitment to play Verdugo over Dominguez towards the end of the season. But supposedly Dominguez views himself as a natural center fielder, and that's where he's played a lot over the course of his career, and he was somewhat uncomfortable in left field. So we're going to have to see what, if anything, the Yankees have with Dominguez at some point. So if he ends up being the starting center fielder and lets Judge push back to right, that would be fine as well. Certainly think the Yankees need to add another bat at some point, whether it's a center fielder, a first baseman, a third baseman. I'm sure they're in talks with the crew that is out there, and hopeful that they will do something to improve and continue improving the roster in the coming weeks. It's been a good week for the Yankees after they lost Soto, which was obviously a huge hit. And hopefully they can make some progress with the everyday players now after they made two big moves for the pitching staff. Back to our fictional world, though, and we're going to be doing our end of the season review in this episode, also taking a look at the playoffs, and we've got some different rooting interests this year. The Rangers, as we noted, took us out, and the Rangers are the team that we have really been battling with more often than not to be at the top of the American League West for about the past decade. Over the last 6 years, the Rangers have won 2 World Series. Our A's have won 2 World Series. The Padres have won a World Series, and they're trying to get back to their 3rd consecutive World Series this year. And the other team that won a World Series was the Dodgers, which is probably more of a logical team to have winning a World Series given their massive budget. But given that Texas has won as many World Series as us over the last 6 years, maybe we're rooting against them a little bit. If San Diego is able to win the World Series this year, that would tie them with our A's and the Rangers for 2 World Series titles over the last 7 years. So perhaps just in an effort to desperately cling to the notion that we might be the best franchise in baseball, I guess we kind of have to be rooting for the Tigers and the Cardinals to perhaps meet in the World Series, or at the very least, one of those teams ends up winning it all. And before we get into our roster review and we start finding out who's going to be playing in the World Series, just a quick review of our stats on the season. Was a very good season, as we noted. Tough April and tough May. We were a 28-28 team as of June 1st. And then after that, we played over 600 baseball every month of the regular season. As I noted, ended up with 99 wins, best in the AL, just a win below expectations. Had the best offense in the American League, 879 runs scored. And we were first, second, or third in every major offensive category, except for stolen bases, where we were 6th. Solid defensive team as well, and we ranked 3rd in the American League in runs allowed, and we were in the top 5 in all of the major pitching categories, except for home runs allowed, where we were the middle of the pack. So a very well-balanced offense, defense, running on the base paths, and pitching combination here from the A's in 2039. And the thought is that we're going to be bringing a good chunk of this team back. So we're probably not going to have to be real active in free agency. And that's a good thing, because we're not going to have a lot of money to spend in free agency, given that we are the Oakland A's. And John Fisher is still our owner. Taking a look at our outstanding pitching staff, I think the thought is that most of these players will be back with us next year, particularly among the starters. Could see a little more turnover among some of our middle relievers. Jesus Saldana, IAFA signing from 7.5 years ago, only won 10 games this year, which was his worst performance in terms of wins in his 3-year major league career. His ERA climbed up to 3.99, so that's as high as it's ever been. That being said, his 5 WAR was kind of exactly what he did over the first 2 years of his career. His SIERA has always been in the high 2s and low 3s. Tied for his career high with 194 strikeouts, and certainly looking at his profile, expect that he's going to be a very important pitcher for us for many years to come. Chase Dora, who we picked up in that big trade with Cincinnati a few years ago, got them to retain a good chunk of his contract, likely heading into his final season with us. He's 31 years old, heading into the last year of the contract that he had signed years ago with the Reds. 14-5 with an ERA just under 4 for us this year, put up a 2.6 WAR. He conceivably could be shuffled a little back in the rotation from his number 2 starter role this year, as some of us are, hopefully our young pitchers develop. But certainly envision a prominent role for Dora next year. Doug Weiss, his second year as a starter for us, 10-6 record, 3.36 ERA, a WAR of over 4. He has now been up for closing in on 4 full seasons, going to be making a lot of money, over $7 million in arbitration next year. Still a guy who understands his value on the open market, looking for over $200 million for a 10-year deal. So given that he's fragile physically, he's going to be 28 before next season, probably just continue going year to year with Mr. Weiss, the Austin P product. Mike Blumenshine, who we did sign to a big front-loaded extension, so that contract will become more reasonable over the years, had a real rough rookie season for us. 2 stints on the IL, a 1-3 record with a 5.20 ERA. He was just below replacement level. Looking at his profile, still think he can be a pretty effective left-handed pitcher for us. But he is fragile, so keeping him on a pitch count and hopefully doing what we can to keep him healthy is going to be very important. Federico Ariola, second-round pick of ours 5 years ago, made his major league debut in September, put up a sub-2 ERA over 14 2/3 innings. Certainly will be fighting for a spot in the rotation this upcoming year. And another guy who will certainly be in the mix is Dave Baumler. He was our number 5 starter when the season began, moved into the number 4 starter role when Blumenshine suffered all those injuries. And he had an outstanding rookie year, 13-6 record, sub-4 ERA, more than 2 wins above replacement. Suffered an elbow injury right at the end of the regular season, so unfortunately did not get an opportunity to pitch for us in the playoffs. But view him as being a potential number 4, number 5 starter next year. The thing that will probably work in Baumler's advantage is that he does have that captain personality if he's in the rotation. And given that, as we'll talk about shortly, we could be looking to move on from our veteran first baseman, who's our other captain personality. If we do that, that could be the tying factor that allows Mr. Baumler to find a spot in the rotation for us next year, given that he was second on the team in 13 wins. And he's only 24 years old, certainly would expect that he'll get a first crack at a rotation spot next season. Turning our attention to our bullpen, left-handed closer Chuck Huntley, who did win the Mariano Rivera Award a year ago. Not as good a season for us. His ERA went up 2.5 runs. Fortunately, it was so low before, it was still a respectable 3.71 ERA. Still struck out over 12 batters per 9 innings and put up a 2.7 WAR. His Sierra and his FIP minus were basically where they were a year ago. Still doesn't give up a ton of home runs, but definitely gave up more hits this year as his whip moved from 1.01 to 1.27. Still think the lefty is going to be a very important part of our bullpen heading into his first arbitration year, set to make about $4.6 million. He's another guy, though, who is looking for pretty big money, $150 million over 10 years if we were to sign him to a long-term extension. So I think for the time being, keep going year to year with him. Mike Orozco is a guy that we did sign to a long-term extension, similar to Blumenshine, who we already talked about. It's front-loaded, so those numbers will be coming down in the future. All he's done in 2 years in Oakland is our stopper, is lead the league in games pitched both years. Pitch 149 2/3 innings this year while leading the league with 24 holds, 42 shutdowns compared to 14 meltdowns, sub-3 ERA, 178 strikeouts while working out of the bullpen, 1.8 WAR on the season. So a very solid pitcher, Pinky Orozco. Do worry about the fragility, but he's held up pretty well for us thus far. Blanco is the third guy that we signed to a front-loaded contract this past off-season when we had a lot of money this year that we weren't going to lose. So hopefully those contracts to those 3 pitchers that are declining over time will prove to give us some financial flexibility 3 or 4 years from now. Solid year for him out of the bullpen, 7 wins, 1 save, 18 holds, 3.71 ERA with 84 strikeouts over 68 innings pitched. Barely was above replacement level. A bit surprising when you look at his profile. I think the big difference, obviously, between this year and a season ago was the 15 home runs he gave up in 68 innings this year compared to just allowing 6 in 88 1/3 innings last year. Looking at the movement on his pitches, his home run allowed rating is a little bit above average, so would think that perhaps he got a little unlucky this year. Probably was a little lucky the year before. The number of home runs he's going to allow is probably kind of in between what he did in 2038 and 2039. Lefty Kevin Carmichael picked him up in a trade with Toronto. Honestly, wasn't as good as we hoped. 5-5 record, a couple of saves, 4.28 ERA over 54 and 2/3 innings. Was basically a replacement level reliever for us a year after putting up close to a WAR of 4, primarily pitching as a starter for Toronto. We're expecting him to be more effective working out of the bullpen. Still think he's got a prominent spot as a lefty out of the bullpen for us, with Huntley as our closer, Orozco and Blanco as righties, and then Carmichael as a second lefty to pair with Huntley. Really like those top 4 guys out of the bullpen. Jonathan Scherer had a really nice year for us. 2.50 ERA over 50 1/3 innings pitched, struck out 66 batters, and the former 15th round draft pick has developed into a pretty good looking setup man or middle reliever for us. So would expect that all 5 of those guys are back. Got some decisions with the guys who are middle relievers. Alan Hunsaker, veteran, we signed to a $2.25 million contract. Put up a 3.80 ERA for us over 42 and 2/3 innings. Solid right-handed reliever, brings a lot of positive things to the clubhouse. And he's not looking for a ton of money, less than $2 million a year for a 3-year extension. So we're going to give a little bit of thought to whether we want to think about bringing back Suds Hunsaker. And then Mike Ross, who we picked up in the Rule 5 draft from Detroit this past year. Not great for us, 5.14 ERA over 68 1/3 innings pitched. Allowed a sickly 17 home runs, so a home run every 4 innings. Almost a win below replacement level. Feel like with Blumenschein in the rotation as our only lefty in the rotation, and then right now only Carmichael and Huntley as lefties in the bullpen. Would love to have another lefty in the mix. When I look at Ross's ratings, I think we should certainly strongly consider bringing him back. But when I look at what he's done over the field for us, and even more broadly as a player over the past few years in the majors, doesn't look like he's really anything special. He's also set to make about $2.5 million in arbitration, which for a guy who was, as I noted, a win below replacement level this year, is probably more than I'd like to spend. But feeling with the guys that we've talked about in both the starting rotation and the bullpen, we haven't even mentioned Ernesto Camunez, who came up and pitched game 162 for us and is also knocking on not just a major league roster spot, but potentially a spot in our rotation. Feel that we're really not going to need to do too much with this pitching staff this upcoming offseason. Hunsaker and Ross are both decisions. Kamani O'Banner, Gigolo O'Banner, who did not even make the postseason roster. And Bobby Garland, the at this point veteran lefty, who also did not make the postseason roster. Probably guys that we're going to be moving on from this offseason, both eligible to be free agents, and given the strength of the pitchers that we've just talked through, and particularly in the case of O'Banner, who's looking for about $7 million a year over 3 years, think that perhaps leveraging our farm system a bit this offseason to maybe fill that 12th or 13th spot on our pitching staff is the likely path that we'll go. Just to check in on those 2 guys that I did mention, though, O'Banner, not a great year for us this year, 4.54 ERA. Did have a prominent role for us, started 4 games, 48 games that he pitched in overall, pitched over 100 innings, and was slightly below replacement level. Going to be 30 soon, and as I mentioned, he's looking for actually closer to $8 million a year over 3 years, so probably not a guy that we'll be bringing back. And similarly, Bobby Garland, a guy who's been an important pitcher for us over the years, actually started 17 games for us this year when Blumenshine was injured, came in to be our number 5 starter, as he often has over the past several years. ERA of close to 5, over 104 innings pitched, allowed 21 home runs, another guy who was below replacement level. His control has always been a concern of ours. Set to make about $2.5 million next year. So I would say between O'Banner and Garland, and then Ross and Hunsaker, who both were on our pitching staff when we got to the postseason, I would guess that at most one of those 4 pitchers is back with us in 2040. And it's possible we move on from all 4 of them. And before we take a look at our position players, we'll find out who's going to be appearing in the World Series this year. But as we've started moving forward, we also see the class of international amateur free agents. We've got a ton of scouting to do on these guys. Looks like a catcher and infielder heavy class. Quick look at some of the top prospects. First baseman Guinard Hoodoo Caprera. Looks like a really good potential bat. A lot of work to do with the glove for the left-handed hitting first baseman. Salvador Sabola, potentially outstanding home run power and a potentially excellent eye for the middle infielder. Venezuelan who just turned 16 years old. Sergio Jas out of the Dominican, nickname Fungo. Looks like a potentially really interesting bat with well above average contact and home run power if he fully develops. Right fielder Jorge Morfa. Looks like he potentially has outstanding stuff right now with that 35 stamina and only a 2-pitch arsenal. Probably much more likely to ultimately end up as a reliever than a starter. Shortstop Edgar Otero, shortstop, pretty solid glove already for a 16-year-old, and looks like his bat could be decent if he reaches his full potential, also durable. Dual Dominican and English nationality, that's a combination you don't necessarily see every day among Major League Baseball prospects. Center fielder Luis Villarreal, potentially outstanding contact hitter with potentially great gap power and outstanding speed. So this is a guy who looks like he could be slamming extra base hits all over the field with those line drive profile and the spray hitting tendencies. Not a ton of home run power, not going to draw a ton of walks. Getting into some of the catchers now. South African Tawasi Zuabri looks like a respectable defensive catcher already, although not a great arm, potentially excellent home run power. Another catcher, Juan Soriano, out of the Dominican, potentially world-class home run power and an outstanding eye, solid defensively. Question is just how much contact is the guy going to make and how often is he going to strike out. But a very interesting profile for Pata Joraba. Another pitcher, Olegario Orvalho. Looks like more of a starting pitching prospect here. Outstanding stamina, potential 3 to 4 pitch arsenal. I think his stuff, movement, and control could all be above average. Definitely looking to get paid. Not the most loyal player and not the best leader in the clubhouse. And last, but hopefully not least, Luis Reyes, 16-year-old out of Mexico. Respectable looking defensive catcher. He's durable. Looks like could have a decent bat as well. So we'll be doing a lot more scouting of all of these players when we get to January. We'll probably do what we typically do and finish off an episode right when the IAFA period is beginning to leverage the wisdom of the Worldwide Scouting Department and give us some suggestions on who to pursue and perhaps the strategies that we should pursue. But we're several months away from that in game time at this point. I had mentioned Ernesto Camunez is going to be competing with Federico Arriola and some of the other guys on our pitching staff for a spot in the rotation next year. Didn't look deep in Camunez. He did pitch, just as I mentioned, game 162 of the year for us, where he was outstanding. 11 strikeouts over 6 1/3 innings in his major league debut, after going 15-1 with a 2.75 ERA in AAA, the international free agent signing from just 4.5 years ago. Only 21 years old, will turn 22 before the start of next season. I would tend to think that between Camunez and Arriola, we will probably manipulate both of their playing time a bit over the first couple months of next season to ensure that we'll get a little extra time and extra control with them. Because unfortunately for us, both of those guys are looking for pretty big money at this point. Dozer Camunez, actually, that contract I think has come down from what we were looking at. He's looking for $75 million over 10 years. That may be a number that we look to seriously think about hitting. Camunez, more demanding, looking for about $113 million over 10 years. Don't love that Camunez is fragile, but we have found over the years in the last several versions of this game that if we put an aggressive tiredness hook on pitchers, keep the pitch count reasonably low, we've had reasonable success keeping the starters healthy. I may explore trying to maybe lock up Dozer Camunez for the medium to long term right now. I don't know that he's an ace, given that we think his stuff is kind of major league average, maybe a little better, but do think he's going to have good control, good movement on his pitches, not give up a ton of homers, 3 above average major league pitches, still working on the slider, good stamina, great influence in the clubhouse, extreme ground ball tendencies. We've got pretty good infield defense at this point, throws in the mid to high 90s. There's a lot to like about Camunez. Think he could be a very solid 2 or 3 starter for us for the next decade. So we may look to get creative and try to lock him up. I think you could certainly argue that Arriola and Doug Weiss, the 2 guys that are looking for more money that we haven't been able to lock up as pitchers, are perhaps better than Blumenshine, who we have locked up, and Camunez as potential starters. But if we can maybe get a second one of these young starters locked up for the long term, and then plan on potentially letting Weiss and Arriola play through their minimum salary years and their arbitration years before we have to really compete to maybe bring one of them on board as a free agent, might be the right approach, given that the finances are always a significant constraint with these Oakland Athletics. And we're going to get really aggressive with what we're offering to Dozer Camunez. Like to kind of sometimes when we're doing contracts, just do something a little different to hopefully learn something for ourselves, and more importantly, share some information with viewers that might be healthy, well, hopefully the viewers are healthy, but I meant to say share something with the viewers that might be helpful. As I noted, looking for close to $76 million over 10 years. We're going to offer him a front-loaded contract. We're going to guarantee him a spot in the starting rotation. But the final 2 years, when he's in his 30s, we're going to have team options just in case his health is not good. But the total value of this contract is $60 million over 10 years. So obviously that's about 20% lower than what he's looking for. I think particularly given that we threw the team options at the end, might be a little aggressive and he might say, hey, I want more than that. Could even come back and say, hey, I want a lot more than that, and make the negotiations more difficult for us. But we are, guaranteeing a guy who's going to be making the major league minimum next year, $9 million for next season, which is certainly a massive amount of money for 99.99999% of the 21-year-olds in this world. So we'll see what he thinks. And he's actually willing to think about it. So glad that we were a little perhaps more aggressive, trying to put the terms and conditions in our favor. If he becomes, as we think he could be, a real solid number 2 or 3 starter for us, the $5 million that he's going to be making over hopefully what will be the prime of his career could be a very attractive deal for us here in Oakland. So we're going to submit that offer to Dozer Camunez. 10 years, $60 million. Again, pretty bold for a 21-year-old who's fragile, who has literally pitched 1 game in his major league career. But the rankings and our scouts say he's going to be successful. He's been someone who we've thought very highly of since we made him a priority in the IAFA pool several years ago. And he obviously did outstanding in the 1 game that he's pitched at the major league level. So hopefully Dozer Camunez will end up being someone that we can build around for the next decade of this Oakland A's series. And great news, Camunez has signed that extension. The fans are ecstatic, even though he is a youngster. He is extremely popular by virtue of being a prominent prospect in our organization, number 88 prospect in baseball, and having done a fantastic job in his 1 game that he did pitch for us. So that finally pushes us to 100 in fan interest. We were 99 before. I'm sure we'll probably lose some points over the course of the off season, but that's something we've been working on extensively over the years. Hopefully, at some point, the fan loyalty will bounce off of that minimal level. We've now made the playoffs 9 times. 9 times, Bueller, with this fantastic run that we have had here in Oakland. With the playoff appearance this year, as I noted, 9 playoff appearances in the last 11 years and the 3 World Series titles. And we've won over 90 games now, 6 of the last 7 seasons. At some point, you would think the fans would realize that we might know a little bit about what we're doing. And even though they hate John Fisher, we're going to try to put a pretty good product on the field for them consistently. And as we get ready for the World Series with Camunez locked up, our bitter rivals, the Rangers, are going to be in the World Series. So they're pursuing a 3rd title in the past 7 seasons, which would obviously top the 2 that we've won. The Padres, who were looking for a 3rd consecutive appearance in the World Series, they won 2 years ago. We beat them in the World Series last season. Despite having the best record in baseball, got knocked out by the Cardinals. So it looks like if we're going to continue to just be haters, we're going to be rooting for the Cardinals in this World Series. But before we get to the World Series, we're going to take a look at our everyday players. Quite honestly, similar to our pitching staff, I think we're going to be bringing a lot of these guys back next year with 2 key exceptions that we'll talk through shortly. And given that we had the best offense in the AL this year, pretty confident that we can have a strong offense again next year. I'd say the big question we have is the number of left-handed hitters. Jorge Mendoza, the catcher who we made a big trade for with the Twins about a year and a half ago, 268 average, 17 homers, 61 ribbies, put up a 129 WRC plus, a WAR of close to 4. A very good offensive player, a very good defensive catcher, some good personality traits, set to be making a lot of money, over $9 million next year. Another guy that likely we won't be able to afford when he's hitting free agency, but we do still have 2 more arbitration eligible seasons ahead with him. Hidetaka Ogata, picked up in a trade with the Dodgers right at the start of this past offseason. Hit just .228 for us, but still was almost a win above replacement. An outstanding defensive catcher who's borderline competent offensively. But for a backup catcher, he is cheap and does bring that outstanding defense. Still going to be making the major league minimum next year. So Mendoza and Ogata will likely be back behind the plate for us. The 2 prominent players that we could be moving on from are the next 2 that we're going to talk about. We'll start with Juan Ramos. He is one of only 2 left-handed hitters in our roster right now, along with Mendoza. So losing that big left-handed power bat could be hard for us. That said, we do have Alejandro Landin, who's a switch hitter, and Jake Ortega, who's a switch hitter. So we've got 2 prominent offensive players who will at least be batting left-handed against right-handed pitching, which hopefully will give us enough balance in the lineup if we do move on from Ramos. Ramos, who we picked up in that trade with Seattle a few years ago when he was injured, definitely has gotten less productive for us over the years. Batting average dipped all the way to .237 this year. Did have 30 homers and 92 ribbies, put up a 116 WRC+. So still a very effective offensive player. Does not bring much of anything to the table defensively, however. And as you can see, his WARs with us have been decreasing over the past 3 years. His first year with us led the American League with 148 ribbies, although he only put up a 2.3 WAR, put up a 4.2 WAR the next season when he hit the career-high 42 homers, led the league in walks a year ago, but just a 1.1 WAR this year. Fragile physically, gonna be 30. And he's looking for $20 million a year for 8 years, given that we do have some good young talent in our organization, admittedly without necessarily the same home run power and certainly not the same eye that Ramos has, but think it might be a option for us to have some younger talent on the team next year and also potentially move the franchise Jake Ortega into a less demanding role, which could include some time at DH as we try to keep him healthy in what could be his final year with Oakland. So we'll almost certainly be moving on from Ramos, and we could be moving on from Jake Bauers. We talked about him, a player that we picked up in a trade with the Red Sox. Still has a couple years left to go on his contract. The Red Sox retained just over half of that. So I think he's a guy that we could trade. 33 years old, fragile physically, real good influence in the clubhouse with that captain personality. But the bat at this point is only a little bit below average. Batting average .258 this year. Did have 36 doubles, 18 homers, 83 ribbies, but a 112 WRC plus and a 1.6 WAR. Given that the Red Sox are still paying 60% of his contract, and he does bring solid speed, a solid bat, and a great influence to a team, I don't think we're going to get a ton in return for trade if we do shop him when we get to the offseason. But given the number of young infielders and outfielders we have in the organization, I think we have people who are capable of similar offensive production at first base at a lower price point. So given that we're almost certainly going to be moving on from Ramos, particularly since we just spent a real good chunk of the cash that we thought we might have available this upcoming offseason on that front-loaded extension for Mr. Camunez, and we conceivably could also be moving on from Mr. Bauers. Not going to be surprising that most of the rest of the infielders that we're going to be talking about are guys that we do expect to have back with us next season. As those of you who have been following us loyally over the course of this series know, we've been pretty aggressive at times trying to sign young players to extensions early. We did that with Amari Alcindor, and sometimes those contracts work out incredibly, as Jake Ortega's has. Sometimes they don't work out at all, and sometimes they're questionable. And I'd say that's where we are with Alcindor at this point. When we look at his ratings, his defensive versatility, good bunter, good base running instincts, even though he's not that fast, I think he can still be a pretty valuable player for us. But he had a brutal major league season this year. Hit just 208 with a 49 WRC plus over 62 games. And was a late season call-up, but in the beginning of June, we sent him to Las Vegas, where he was much more productive, and he spent most of the year there until September. But particularly if we're opening up some playing time, moving on from Ramos and or Bowers, Alcindor should be in the mix to at least be a utility infielder for us next year. Alejandro Landin, former IAFA signing, arguably the best season of a very impressive career. Led the American League with 40 homers, also had 42 doubles, scored and drove in over 100 runs, 292 average, 148 WRC plus, and a 6.5 WAR, as he is also a very good defensive middle infielder. The switch hitter, Flea Landin, likely to receive some pretty significant support for American League MVP this year, although I don't think he'll win it. He's a guy who we signed to a long-term contract that has worked out incredibly well for us. Going to make $5 million next year, and then team options at $5 million when he's in his 30s for the final 2 years of this deal. And unless something shocking happens, we'll be exercising those options. Rodney Mesidor, a utility infielder for us this year, was a starter not that long ago. Hit 300 for us, but only 89 at-bats, even though he was on the Major League roster all season, as we just have a very strong infield. He's arbitration eligible, set to be making $4.5–5 million next year. Given the price tag and given the likelihood that Alcindor will be manning at least one of our utility infielder roles next year, I think we probably move on from Mesidor. Part of the reason why we can is that Juan Pimentel, when we did send Alcindor down in June, was called up in June, and the number 10 prospect in baseball, despite spending the first 2 months of the season in the minors, is going to be a very strong candidate for AL Rookie of the Year. Hit 342 with 32 doubles, 6 triples, and 22 homers and 430 at-bats. Scored over 80 runs, drove in over 80, despite playing in just 102 games. 162 WRC plus, a 5.1 WAR. Mentioned that our infield defense is pretty solid, and with Pimentel likely locked in as our third baseman for years to come, I think that similar to second base with Landin, is a position that we feel real good about. Pimentel, we signed him to a 10-year, $85 million extension earlier this year, pretty much right when we brought him up. Not front-loaded, but still based on his initial performance in the majors, could be a very good contract for us. And then Andy Toribio likely will be back as our shortstop. He's a guy we picked up in a trade with the Giants a long time ago, developed him through our organization. Has not hit as well as we thought he might his first couple years with us in the majors, but still is a very solid defensive infielder. A little pop in his bat, 14 homers, 30 doubles, stole 21 bases in 28 attempts this year. The 243 batting average, not particularly impressive, but a 95 WRC plus and a 2.6 WAR, thanks largely to his defense. The fans like him. He's headed into some team option years. Probably the favorite to be our starting shortstop next year. but we do have some young infield talent on the way. So he could end up pivoting if guys like Alcindor end up producing the way that we hope he will over the coming years into more of a utility infielder role before we likely move on from Toribio in a couple of seasons. So thinking about the infield, even if we move on from Bowers, Ramos, and Mesidor, feel like we're set at second base with Landin, third base with Pimentel, shortstop with Toribio, and then Alcindor at the very least could be a excellent utility infielder for us. And with his profile, we could conceivably think about giving him a shot at being our everyday first baseman as well. Also have some younger players in the minors that are pushing as well. So feel pretty good about catcher, pretty good about infield, even if we move on from some players. And then our outfield is also pretty strong, quite honestly. Darnell Selvey, you may remember him. We picked him 26th overall 4 years ago in 2035. The 23-year-old has had a pretty strong rise through our organization. Played only 43 games in AAA over the course of the end of last year and the beginning of this year before we promoted him. And he hit .297 with 20 homers, 81 ribbies, and 32 doubles in just over 400 at-bats. 150 WRC plus, OPS over 900, and a 4.1 WAR. His performance made it real easy for us to trade away Mike Alanis before the trade deadline. Would assume that Selvey is our starting left fielder next year. Joe Harmon, former second-round pick of ours in 2032, split the year between AAA and the majors, has not been particularly impressive in his limited stints in the majors. Hit .208 for us this year in 77 at-bats, barely above replacement level. Does have good speed, is a solid, versatile defensive outfielder, some positive personality traits. Fragile physically, but certainly should be in the mix to be a fourth or fifth outfielder for us next year. Jake Ortega, the franchise, the 32-year-old, is now wrecked physically. His profile, when he's healthy, is still tremendous, though. Excellent speed, excellent defensively, excellent bat. The issue is that he's going to be 33 next year, and as we noted, he's wrecked physically. Taking a look at what the two-time American League MVP has done at the major league level. And he's played more than 121 games just once in the past 4 seasons. 55 games this year, 61 a couple of years ago. In between, he had his second MVP season as a 30-year-old last year. Although Ortega is still outstanding defensively, I think his bat is the most important thing for us. And that's why with the potential departures of Ramos and Bowers, I'm seriously considering moving Ortega to first base or perhaps even just DH. That bat, and he's our number 3 hitter, is critically important to have in the lineup, hopefully for 150 plus games a year. Although he is our best defensive center fielder, we've got some other solid options out there. So I think coming up with a plan to keep Ortega as healthy as possible for what could be his final year with us here in Oakland when we exercise that team option is something for us to think about. Would love to keep him with us for his entire career. I guess the positive thing is that given that he's wrecked physically and given that he's in his mid-30s, or he will be in his mid-30s by this time next year when we have to start thinking about a contract, maybe he'll be a little more reasonable. Doesn't look like it right now, though. 5 years, $30 million a year for a potential extension. Wants a player option and a no-trade clause. So that's pretty fully valued for what he is, and more importantly, pretty difficult for us to think about with the A's franchise right now, but something that we will keep an eye on. If there's any way for us to ensure that Ortega is a longtime member and a career member of the Oakland A's, we're going to do it. But we've got that team option for next season that we'll certainly exercise. And if we find out that we can keep him pretty healthy in a less strenuous defensive role, maybe we will do what we need to do to clear the money next offseason to bring him back. Sergio Palomares, IAFA signing from over a decade ago at this point. The 27-year-old, solid defensively, excellent speed, and a pretty interesting batting profile except for the lack of power. But honestly, he's been, I'd say, a little bit disappointing offensively. The 105 WRC plus is not bad. 3.7 WAR this year when he played a lot of center field for us, given the loss of Ortega. Certainly more than respectable. But looking at his profile, would have thought that he was going to be more than a 252 hitter, and the 239 that he hit for us this season was definitely disappointing. That said, he stole 33 bases, 102 WRC plus, so was overall an average offensive player with some really good defense for us. And if we do end up moving Mr. Ortega off of center field, guys like Harmon and or Palomares hopefully could give us pretty solid defense out there. So Selvey will be in left, likely Harmon, Ortega, Palomares, or some combination of them will be in center. And then Arturo Uresti will be our right fielder next year. Hit 247 this year, 37 homers and 100 runs driven in, 125 WRC plus and a 4.2 WAR. Really good home run power, a really good eye. He drew 77 walks this year. Solid defensively, good personality, durable in terms of his injury proneness. Signed to a contract that's going to be a pretty significant number for us when he gets into his 30s. Not front-loaded, unlike some of those other contracts that we've signed. But over the course of Uresti's career, he's put up a 124 WRC plus over 3.5 seasons. Already has 102 home runs in less than 1,900 major league at-bats. So a very important home run threat in the middle of our lineup. So when I think about the team next year, I'd say Selvey in left is definite. Uresti in right is definite. Ortega and Palomares in center field, DH, utility type roles is almost certain. I guess the question is whether Joe Harmon will be back as a utility outfielder for us, because we also have some other interesting guys in the organization who could be competing for that role as well. And the two most prominent to consider are Danny Phelps, who we picked up in a trade with Boston 2.5 years ago. Spent the entire season this year in AAA, where he was a league average offensive player. Going to be 27 years old. Do like the fact that he's a left-handed hitter. That's probably the thing that he has going for him the most, given that we could be moving on from Ramos and really have only one lefty in our lineup every day, and that's a catcher who's going to need a fair amount of time off. But don't love that his home run power is not exceptional and at almost 27 years old, although we think he hasn't tapped his full potential. If he hasn't tapped most of it now, I don't know that Gabby Phelps is going to magically tap it going forward. Sam Gentile, another 27-year-old, a guy we picked up in a trade in 2037 also, had a monster season in AAA, 317 average, 24 homers, 11 triples, or 24 doubles, 11 triples, 42 homers, 121 runs scored, 120 ribbies. Captain personality, a solid, respectable bat, good speed, solid defensively. So between Phelps, Gentile and Harmon. We've got three very capable players who could be competing for that number 5 outfielder spot next year. They are all at this point out of options. So that is going to put us into a position where we're only likely going to have one of them back on the team next year. Going to have some interesting decisions to make this offseason. And it's not inconceivable that maybe we can pair one of those players in a trade with somebody like Bowers to potentially bring back a interesting prospect in return. So as we think about next season, really kind of like where we are in terms of our pitching and our position players. Even if we lose Ramos and Bowers, who combined for 48 home runs, you can see that 8 out of the 10 players on our, or 8 out of the 9 players in our everyday roster had double-digit home runs, and the one who didn't is Jake Ortega, who's, when healthy, still our best offensive player. And if we can get him into a less strenuous offensive or defensive role next year, certainly would expect him to be well over 20 homers if we get 150 plus games out of him. So before we finish up this episode, we'll find out who wins the World Series and get to the first day of the off season, when we will get an inclination from Mr. Fisher as to what our budget might look like next year, which will certainly help inform what we do when the off season gets underway. And the St. Louis Cardinals took out the Texas Rangers 4-2. The Cardinals with a pretty dominant playoff run. They had a first-round bye. They swept the Phillies in 3 games, took out the Padres 4-1. And then after falling behind the Rangers 2-1 in the World Series, won the final 3 games to clinch the title. So neither the Padres nor the Rangers won. So over the last 7 seasons, we're tied with Texas for the best in baseball at 2 titles apiece. And the Padres, the Cardinals, and the Dodgers have 1 championship each from the National League. And the off-season gets underway today. Offline, we'll be spending a lot of time thinking about our development facilities, and we'll certainly let you know what happens there. Looks like we've lost our hitting coach in the DSL, so we're going to have a couple of holes to fill in the lower levels of our minor league system. Jake Ortega and Andy Toribio, both with option year decisions, as we've talked about. We will be executing both of those options. I don't think there's any need to be clever about this. We are going to execute the option on Toribio, who will likely be our starting shortstop, and we are going to execute the option on Ortega, who will hopefully be in the lineup every day for us at some position next year. Reviewing the season goals, Fisher wanted us to make the playoffs, which we did. Not happy that we haven't signed a Gold Glove winner. Wants us to bring home another World Series in the future. Overall, he's happy with our performance in accomplishing goals, and he's very happy with our overall performance. Wants us to reach the playoffs, upgrade at first base, acquire that Gold Glove winner, and build a dynasty in the next 4 seasons, which is probably another couple championships at this point. What kind of money are we going to have to do that? I believe we were at about $190 million this past year. And we're going to have $198 million available. So it's weird, like the years that we make massive amounts of money and win the World Series, Fisher does not seem to increase our budget. I think we just eked out a tiny profit this year and got bounced in the first round of the playoffs. And that's a year that he's going to apparently, I believe, give us a bump in. Yeah, we've been $190 million for the last couple years, so $198 million will be the largest budget that we have ever had to work with Mr. Fisher. Made pretty steady progress over the past decade. Unfortunately, fan loyalty is still minimal, as despite the excellent performance we've had on the field over the last decade plus at this point, the fans still aren't buying it. Tied for 27th in budget, which is as high as we've ever been. You can see our player payroll is 19th right now. That will likely be going down. We may end up spending a bit more money, but our ranking will likely end up in the mid-20s when all is said and done, if not a little lower, because we really don't have any money available to spend at this point, and going to have to tweak our scouting and player development budgets a bit to make things work for this offseason. We will be moving on from some arbitration-eligible players, as I noted, which should help. Garland, possibly Ross, Dolan, Mesidor are arbitration-eligible guys that we won't likely bring back, which should free up a little more money for us. As I mentioned, we've got a decision to make on Hunsaker. Technically also have decisions on O'Banner and Ramos, but I think we've largely made those at this point. See what Ramos is looking for. 8 years, $24 million. So pretty comfortable submitting a QO to him to hopefully at least get some draft pick compensation in return. So we've got a lot to think about as we get ready for this 2039 to 2040 off season. Don't think it's going to be incredibly active. Maybe we make a few trades, play on the margins of the free agent market, and we'll talk about who is going to be on the free agent market, as well as do a deeper analysis of our farm system and some of the guys who might be able to help us in the not too distant future in our next episode. Until then, thanks so much for watching, and hope you have a great day.